Okay, tonight, we're going back to Atlanta, 1965. A city alive with ambition, neon lights, and the soft hum of a nation on the edge of change. But somewhere between those glowing streets and the silence of dawn, a young woman simply vanished. No witnesses, no screams, only a few smudges of blood, a folded dress, and receipts that didn't make sense. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Here we listen to the echo between truth and fear, where each unanswered question lingers like a ghost. Tonight's case is one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history. The cold case of Mary Shotwell Little, a 25-year-old newlywed who disappeared just 6 weeks after her wedding and never came home again. Atlanta, 1965, a city of polished marble and quiet ambition, where glass towers began to scrape at the southern sky. Every evening the lights from the Citizens and Southern Bank shimmered against the damp pavement of Peachtree Street. The air was thick with the smell of rain and gasoline, mingling with the hum of progress. On the surface everything appeared calm, ordinary, even comforting. Yet beneath that calm something restless was moving. Something no one could see, but everyone could sense. Mary Shotwell. Little fit perfectly into that polished illusion of order. At 25, she was the image of a young woman living the American dream. Her days began with the soft rhythm of typewriter keys and the polite murmur of bank clients. She worked as a secretary at Citizens and Southern Bank, diligent, dependable, the kind of employee who never arrived late and never raised her voice. Those who knew her spoke of her gentleness. Mary had a soft way of smiling, as if kindness was something she carried quietly inside. She was 25, newly married to Roy Little, a steady, dependable man who loved her deeply. They had been husband and wife for just 6 weeks, two young souls building a life that seemed simple and sure. In a city caught between old manners and new ambitions, they looked like a promise, a glimpse of hope in changing times. At the bank where she worked, Mary was known for her grace and composure. She dressed neatly, spoke gently, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her handwriting was precise, her desk always in order. But in the weeks before she vanished, something subtle shifted. She grew distant, her smile thinner, her gaze lingering on nothing. A friend remembered Mary once saying she felt like someone was following her. It was said half-jokingly, the way people dismiss the flutter of unease. Atlanta was safe, or so everyone believed. Roy was away on business during those days, writing her affectionate letters from the road. Mary wrote back too, about her routine, her work, and the loneliness that crept in at night. The kind of loneliness that feels harmless, until it isn't. There were whispers too, about an old boyfriend, a shadow from before the wedding. No one knew much about him, just that he lingered in conversation the way an unfinished story does. Some said he had trouble letting go. Others dismissed it as gossip, the kind that thrives in southern cities where politeness often hides obsession. Atlanta in the mid-60s was a paradox. The skyline was climbing higher each year, yet its foundations were layered with tension, racial unrest, gender expectations, and the invisible walls of social class. It was a place that looked forward while still chained to its past. For young women like Mary, life was a delicate performance, to be graceful, dependable, modern, but never too independent, never too visible. At the bank, the routine masked the quiet dissonance of those expectations. Mary's co-workers, mostly women, carried similar burdens behind their polite smiles. They were secretaries, tellers, assistants, the machinery behind men's ambitions. But Mary had dreams too. She and Roy had spoken about starting a family, buying a small home near Decatur, maybe traveling one day. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. In the evenings, after work, she would drive her pale grey Mercury Comet through the heart of the city, past neon-lit diners, newsstands, and the soft jazz spilling from bar windows. The radio stations played the Supremes, the Beatles, or Simon and Garfunkel, the sound of a country changing. Yet for all that change, danger still moved in silence. Atlanta's social scene had its own undercurrents. The city was proud of its growth, but it was also a place of secrets, where everyone knew someone, and gossip traveled faster than any headline. Beneath the charm of church picnics and polite gatherings were unspoken scandals, affairs, and debts no one wanted to mention. People pretended not to notice, but everyone did. And in that environment, disappearance wasn't unthinkable. It was simply inconvenient. Mary's disappearance would soon shatter that fragile civility. But before that night, she was still just Mary, a young woman balancing duty and quiet longing. After work, she often walked to her car with a co-worker, laughing about dresses or weekend plans. Lately, though, her laughter sounded thinner, more rehearsed than real. One colleague remembered a small moment, Mary pausing mid-sentence, eyes distant. "Sorry," she'd murmured. "Just lost my train of thought." Then she smiled, and the unease slipped away unnoticed. Roy returned from his trip 2 days before she vanished. They had dinner together. Roast chicken, salad, the rhythm of normal life. She chatted about errands and friends, her voice steady but far away. She didn't seem scared. She didn't seem sad. Just somewhere else, already halfway gone. He kissed her goodbye that morning before leaving for the airport, unaware it would be the last time he'd ever see her. In the days leading up to October 14th, Atlanta shifted quietly into autumn. The air cooled, leaves turned gold, and the city pulsed with ordinary life, unaware that one of its own was about to vanish. That Thursday evening, Mary left work as usual. She met her friend Anne for dinner at Lenox Square, the city's proud new shopping center, a symbol of its growing modernity. They talked about groceries, weekend plans, small things that fill the space between hours. Nothing strange, nothing memorable. Around 8 p.m., Mary said goodbye. She would stop by the store, then drive home. The rain had begun to fall lightly. Parking lot lights shimmered on wet pavement as she walked toward her car. Her shape flickered in reflections of neon and passing headlights, and then disappeared into the mist. Atlanta slept that night beneath a soft drizzle, the illusion of safety unbroken. But by morning, that illusion would shatter. Her car would be found, her life gone without a trace. Between those last quiet steps and the silence that followed, something unimaginable took her, and the world never saw her again. October 14th, 1965. It was a Thursday night in Atlanta, one of those evenings that slips by unnoticed, wrapped in routine and the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. The sky was low and heavy with mist, and the neon glow of Lenox Square shimmered faintly on puddles scattered across the parking lot. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, sharp but familiar. Inside the S&S cafeteria, conversation mingled with the clatter of trays and silverware. Among the soft hum of laughter was a voice that would soon vanish from the world, that of Mary Shotwell Little. She had come for dinner with 2 of her co-workers after a long day at the Citizens and Southern Bank. They chatted about dresses, errands, and weekend plans. Mary was cheerful and attentive, her smile easy and unforced. Nothing in her words or her manner hinted at unease. When she rose to leave, she told her friends she might stop by the grocery store before going home. Her tone was calm, her posture relaxed, perfectly normal. And yet it is the normal moments that most often turn into ghosts. Around 8 p.m., Mary stepped into the drizzle. The lights of Lenox Square blurred against the damp air as she walked toward her grey Mercury Comet. Her heels tapped softly on wet pavement. Passing headlights rippled over her coat, a brief shimmer, and then she was gone. No one saw her after that. The next morning, Mary didn't show up at work. That alone was cause for alarm. She was punctual, meticulous, the kind of person who arrived early rather than late. By midday, her supervisor called home, then her husband's office. No response. Concern turned to fear. Roy Little, still out of town on business, received the call that afternoon. By nightfall, police had been alerted and a search began. When officers arrived at Lenox Square, the parking lot was nearly empty. Mary's car was still there, locked and untouched, parked neatly as though waiting for her return. What they found inside told a different story. On the front seat lay Mary's purse, her ID, credit cards, and cash still inside. Nothing was missing. On the passenger seat, police discovered a folded pair of women's undergarments, freshly washed, ironed, and carefully placed. There were faint smears of blood on the driver's side door and the seat. Not enough to suggest violence, but enough to break the illusion of order. Then came the receipt, dated October 15th, one day after Mary vanished. It listed groceries and household goods that matched her usual habits. The timestamp, however, showed the purchase occurred when she should have already been missing. Her credit card had also been used to buy gasoline at a station nearly 50 kilometers away. That single detail shifted the entire case. It suggested that after her disappearance, someone else had control of her car, and perhaps of Mary herself. Witnesses began to emerge. A gas station attendant described a woman resembling Mary, silent and pale, sitting beside a man she didn't seem to know. Another driver reported seeing a grey Mercury Comet parked at a lonely rest stop, its interior light flickering faintly. Yet none of these sightings could be verified. Forensic work in 1965 could offer little clarity. DNA testing was still far in the future, and fingerprints revealed nothing conclusive. The blood in her car matched Mary's type, but that proved almost nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no broken fabric or shattered glass, only the eerie impression that she had quietly stepped out of existence. Roy returned to Atlanta overwhelmed, facing investigators and reporters with hollow eyes. He insisted their marriage was stable and ordinary, though detectives could not ignore the possibility that answers often lie close to home. His alibi, however, was airtight. With no suspect, no motive, and no trace, the investigation lost its center. Search efforts yielded nothing. Mary's final steps dissolved into Atlanta's fog, leaving behind only fragments of a life interrupted. The headline echoed across Atlanta. Crowds gathered at Lenox Square, staring at the taped-off parking space as if answers might rise from the asphalt. Reporters speculated endlessly. Was it a kidnapping, a runaway bride, a lover's plot? But the more people searched, the less they found. For days, search teams scoured the highways and wooded outskirts. Tire marks near a back road matched her car model, but a sudden storm washed them away before analysis. Witness statements clashed. Some said the woman they'd seen looked calm, others swore she was terrified. Every lead contradicted the last. A theory began to form, that someone Mary knew had approached her that night. Perhaps an acquaintance, perhaps an ex-lover. She wasn't the type to trust strangers easily. Whoever it was had likely spoken softly, convincingly, the kind of voice that makes you pause instead of run. But another, more unsettling possibility took hold, that Mary had chosen to leave, voluntarily. The folded clothes, the calmness, the methodical details of the receipts. These were not hallmarks of chaos. They hinted at intent. And yet intent cannot explain the blood. It cannot explain why she left her purse, her car, her life. The contradictions knotted tighter with every hour. As the days stretched into weeks, the city's hope faded. Flyers bearing Mary's photograph appeared on street corners and shop windows. The face that once greeted customers at the bank now stared blankly from missing posters, her soft smile frozen in time. New sightings emerged, a woman resembling Mary seen shopping in North Carolina, another entering a motel in Alabama with an unknown man. Each lead collapsed into nothing, each hope dissolved into error. Winter settled over Atlanta, thick with unanswered questions. Detectives gathered in silence, staring at the same car, the same blood, the same receipt, fragments of a life erased. The case froze in time, unresolved yet restless. Mary Shotwell Little had not simply vanished. Someone had ensured her disappearance. And Atlanta never truly recovered. The days following Mary's disappearance turned Atlanta into a city haunted by whispers. Every cafe conversation, every radio broadcast, every newspaper headline seemed to circle back to one question. What happened to Mary Shotwell Little? Detectives from the Atlanta Police Department began their investigation with urgency and confusion. They interviewed everyone connected to Mary. Her husband, friends, colleagues at the Citizens and Southern Bank, even her neighbors. Roy Little, the grieving husband, was naturally the first focus. He returned from his business trip visibly shaken, cooperative but detached, as though his mind hadn't caught up with reality. His alibi was airtight. Multiple witnesses confirmed he was out of town when Mary vanished. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the undertone of Mary's last letters to him. The letters, later reviewed by investigators, painted a portrait of quiet disquiet, a young woman trying to reassure herself that everything was fine. Beneath the tender words and talk of daily routines were flickers of unease, mentions of being watched, dreams of losing her way home. They weren't pleas for help, but they carried the weight of someone trying to steady her own fear. Colleagues recalled subtle changes in her demeanor, nervous glances, distracted silences, an edge beneath her politeness. A friend remembered her mentioning a strange man loitering near her car. Another said she'd received odd phone calls that she laughed off. Lacking evidence, police initially dismissed these accounts as coincidence. Forensics yielded little. The blood in her car was minimal, the fingerprints all her own. Clerks from the grocery store and gas station gave conflicting accounts. One described a woman alone, another a woman with a man, neither matching anyone in Mary's circle. With no leads, the case unraveled into speculation. The media christened it the vanished newlywed case, turning Mary into a haunting symbol of innocence undone. Her face, calm, composed, impossibly distant, stared from newspapers and TV screens, a silent reminder of a mystery that refused to fade. For the public, Mary was no longer just a missing woman. She was the missing woman, the embodiment of every fear that lingered behind suburban comfort. And as often happens when facts fade, speculation filled the void. Some saw Roy as suspicious. Too calm, they said. Others insisted Mary had been abducted by a stranger. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire, secret affairs, double lives, cover-ups. Letters flooded into the police station, from psychics offering visions to strangers claiming to have seen her alive in distant towns. The case consumed Atlanta. Mothers warned daughters not to go out alone. Husbands locked their doors twice at night. The disappearance of one woman had turned into a collective unease, a reminder that evil didn't always hide in dark alleys. Sometimes it parked neatly in a shopping lot under the glow of streetlights. As weeks turned into months, detectives consolidated the case into 3 leading theories. Theory A. Mary ran away with someone she knew. This theory suggested that Mary, feeling trapped or lonely in her new marriage, might have left voluntarily. There were murmurs of an old boyfriend, a man she had once dated before meeting Roy. Some claimed he had recently tried to contact her. The receipts and sightings of her alive seemed to support this narrative, a carefully planned escape disguised as a disappearance. But those who knew Mary found it impossible to believe. She was responsible, devoted, and newly married. Running away didn't fit her character, and the traces of blood contradicted the idea of a peaceful departure. Theory B. She was kidnapped, and the scene was staged. The second and perhaps most widely accepted theory was darker. Investigators speculated that Mary had been abducted in the parking lot by one or more perpetrators. The neatly folded clothes, the intact purse, all could have been deliberate misdirection. The purchases made afterward, they theorized, might have been part of a ruse to confuse the timeline, or to suggest that Mary was still alive. But this too had holes. No witnesses saw a struggle. No one heard screams. And whoever staged the scene did it with an eerie sense of precision. Too careful, too clean. Theory C. The killer was someone she knew. Someone hiding in plain sight. This was the theory that unsettled everyone the most. Perhaps Mary had trusted the wrong person. A co-worker, a family friend, someone familiar enough to approach her without suspicion. The idea that her abductor might have been someone she smiled at daily sent a chill through the community. It also explained why there were no signs of forced entry or panic. She hadn't been tricked by a stranger. She had followed someone she thought she could trust. Each theory had its believers, and each one fractured the public's perception of Mary. To some, she was a victim. To others, a runaway. To a few, a woman leading a secret life no one really understood. Detectives, too, were divided. Files piled up, interviews faded into silence, and the physical trail went cold. What remained were patterns, not of evidence but of behavior, fear and human contradiction. As the years slipped by, Mary's story transformed into legend, a haunting part of Atlanta's folklore, suspended between memory and myth. Detectives reopened the case from time to time, driven by duty or obsession, but nothing new ever appeared. Then, decades later, a retired investigator uncovered a forgotten report. A gas station attendant had once described seeing a grey Mercury comet parked beside a rural highway days after the search had ended. In the passenger seat, he thought he saw a woman slumped forward, her face hidden by hair. The note had been filed away, unread and ignored for years. That rediscovery rekindled the question that had shadowed the city for generations. Not who took Mary, but who knew her well enough to erase her so perfectly. For evil rarely wears a mask. It often smiles, familiar and unassuming. And when the past seemed finally at rest, one overlooked clue surfaced. Quiet, devastating, and enough to unmake everything that had been believed. The years rolled forward, but the silence around Mary Shotwell Little's disappearance never lifted. It was as if she had dissolved into the fog of history, leaving behind only faint echoes, the kind that surface in the quiet hours when the mind wanders toward what it cannot understand. Her name, once printed in headlines and whispered through coffee shops, now lived in the hushed archives of cold case files. But the questions she left behind were not just for detectives, they were for all of us. From a psychological lens, the case of Mary Shotwell Little exposes one of the deepest fears embedded in the human psyche, the fear of vanishing, of being erased, unnoticed, unremembered. For Mary, a young woman of 25, recently married and living in a world that promised stability, her disappearance struck at the very foundation of identity. To disappear without reason is to lose the narrative of the self. To vanish without witnesses is to be stripped of existence itself. Psychologists studying cases like Mary S. often talk about liminal identity, the state of being caught between existence and non-existence. For her family and husband, she was neither alive nor dead. For the community, she became a symbol of uncertainty. This psychological limbo leaves a mark deeper than grief. Grief has an endpoint, ambiguity does not. The case's power lies not in violence but in absence, an absence so total that it becomes its own form of terror. Perhaps Mary was the victim of an obsessed mind, someone drawn to her innocence, her routine, her visibility. Many offenders who commit these acts are driven not by hatred, but by a pathological need for possession, a delusion that if they can control someone completely, even by erasing them, they can quiet the chaos within themselves. Yet, in another reading, perhaps the true killer wasn't a person at all. Perhaps it was loneliness, a quiet predator that stalked Mary through the sterile halls of her office, through the polite smiles of her marriage, through the empty spaces between phone calls that never came. In the 1960s, society demanded that women like Mary embody perfection, gentle, composed, dependent yet graceful. Beneath that facade, many lived lives of suppressed anxiety. The expectation to be the perfect wife, the charming colleague, the reliable friend created a form of invisible pressure, a kind of psychological suffocation. When Mary told her friends she felt watched, perhaps she wasn't just referring to a stranger. Perhaps she was describing the invisible gaze of society itself, the constant scrutiny that leaves no room for vulnerability. Decades after her disappearance, new investigators reopened the case with hope that technology might succeed where human intuition had failed. DNA profiling, digital archives, and modern forensic tools were applied to what little evidence remained: the faded blood samples, the receipts, the photographs of her car. But technology found nothing new. The samples had degraded, the evidence too thin to speak. Every thread led back to silence, as if the universe itself had decided that Mary's story was not meant to be concluded. One retired detective described it best. It is like chasing a shadow that learned to hide its own outline. The re-examination revealed something beyond data, the fragility of closure. In every unsolved mystery, there is a point where logic fails and philosophy begins. From a Stoic perspective, we are reminded that control is an illusion. The Stoics taught that the only thing we truly command is our response to fate, not the events themselves. In that sense, Mary S. disappearance, and as tragic as it is, becomes a reflection of our inability to dominate life and its randomness. She was walking toward her car, perhaps thinking about groceries or the next day's work, unaware that her fate had already detached itself from her will. To accept this, as the Stoics urge, is not resignation. It is clarity, From a Buddhist lens, the story embodies dukkha, the suffering born from attachment. Our obsession with finding answers, with imposing meaning where none may exist, becomes its own form of torment. The families of the missing are often trapped in this suffering, unable to let go because the human heart demands resolution. Buddhism would say that freedom lies not in knowing the truth but in releasing the need to know. The disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little, then, is not just a crime, it is a mirror reflecting our own inability to sit with uncertainty. Yet, as both philosophies remind us, there is a strange peace in surrendering to the unknown. Perhaps the truth of Mary S. fate is less important than what her absence teaches us, that life, fragile and fleeting, resists our desire to make it neat and comprehensible. Still, one question lingers, haunting and unresolved. When we look at cases like this, where a person is swallowed by the void without explanation, we cannot help but wonder, are monsters born or are they made? Maybe the person who took Mary was once ordinary, someone ignored, wounded, unseen. Perhaps evil, in its most disturbing form, is not born from darkness but from neglect. When empathy dies, when connection is severed, when loneliness metastasizes into obsession, that is when ordinary souls become architects of horror. And if that is true, then Mary's story becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a warning. Every act of cruelty, every indifference to another's pain is a small step toward that abyss. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of our lives, we all stand at the edge of that same darkness. In the end, the tragedy of Mary Shotwell Little is not only that she vanished, but that the world, despite all its progress, has yet to learn how to see the unseen, how to hear the silent. Because long after the last lead dies, what remains are not clues or suspects, but echoes. Echoes of fear, of empathy, of all the lives touched by the void she left behind. And sometimes those echoes sound less like a mystery and more like a confession from humanity itself. If fear is a mirror, then the disappearance of Mary Shotwell Little reflects the darkest truth within us, that what terrifies us most is not death, but erasure, to be forgotten, to vanish from memory, leaving behind only paperwork, fading photographs, and unanswered calls. Mary's story lingers because it speaks to that primal dread, the idea that a life can simply stop and the world keeps moving, unshaken. We build cities, write laws, and trust in reason, yet one night of silence can still undo it all. Some believe Mary was taken by a stranger. Others think she walked away from her own life. But perhaps the truth lives somewhere deeper, in the spaces between what we fear, what we repress, and what we refuse to understand. If you found this story haunting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime mysteries. Because some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.